There is a moment in the avoidant experience that almost nobody ever gets to witness. Most avoidant people never talk about it, rarely admit it even to themselves, and often do everything in their power to avoid facing it at all. It does not happen the second you pull away. Hi, I'm Anne, and welcome back. In the beginning, their protective instincts are still working overtime, convincing them that your silence is temporary. They assume the familiar cycle will start up again the way it always has. Part of them believes you will reach out again, that the connection is simply on pause rather than truly changing shape. But as the days stretch on and the silence stays exactly where it is, something starts to shift. The messages never arrive. The pursuit never resumes. Slowly, the realization sets in that you have genuinely stepped away from the exhausting effort of chasing someone who kept choosing emotional distance. When that truth finally lands, it creates one of the most tangled emotional experiences an avoidant person can face. It is not a simple feeling of loss. It is a knot of pride, longing, shame, ego, confusion, and vulnerability, all colliding at the same time. At the center of this internal storm is a realization that many avoidant people find incredibly hard to sit with. They begin to recognize that your decision to stop pursuing them changed the entire balance of the dynamic in a way they never saw coming. You did not set out to prove a point. You did not force a confrontation. You did not try to make them feel small. You simply chose to value yourself enough to stop participating in a pattern that was draining you. Yet that one quiet decision often affects them more deeply than any argument ever could have. Today, I want to walk you through that hidden experience because understanding it offers something far more useful than a moment of satisfaction. Some satisfaction may naturally show up, but the real value here is clarity. It helps explain what actually happened between you, what may still be unfolding beneath the surface on their side, and how the journey into silence changed you long before it ever touched them. One of the most overlooked emotions in avoidant psychology is embarrassment. People tend to focus on fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability, or fear of commitment. But embarrassment plays a surprisingly powerful role once the silence becomes real. To understand why, you have to understand the identity many avoidant people quietly build inside relationships. Underneath the surface, there is often a deeply rooted belief that they are the less dependent one. They see themselves as the person who can walk away more easily, the one who stays less emotionally invested, the one who holds greater control over closeness. This belief rarely gets spoken aloud because it operates quietly in the background. It becomes part of how they understand themselves inside every relationship they enter. They withdraw when emotions get intense. They create distance the moment connection starts to feel like too much. They offer warmth and affection, then pull back the second things get too close. Over time, these patterns reinforce the idea that they hold the power to engage or disengage whenever they choose. As long as you kept reaching for them, that internal story stayed intact. Every message, every attempt to reconnect, every effort to bridge the gap seemed to confirm their belief that they were the less affected one. The dynamic appeared to support the narrative they had quietly built around themselves. They could point to your visible desire for connection and interpret it, consciously or not, as proof they held the stronger emotional position. But the moment your silence became permanent enough to actually feel real, that whole framework started to crack. You did not challenge it through confrontation. You did not demand answers or hand down ultimatums. Instead, you stepped back and let your absence speak for itself. And in doing that, you quietly removed the foundation that had been holding up their self-image the entire time. What makes this so impactful is that it forces them to face a possibility they were never prepared for. The possibility that they were not nearly as detached, unaffected, or emotionally independent as they believed themselves to be. You did not attack them with accusations. You did not create a dramatic ending that would let them retreat behind familiar defenses. You simply withdrew your energy from a connection that had stopped honoring your value, and that quiet decision changed everything. The story they had been telling themselves suddenly lost its footing. The person they assumed would always stay emotionally invested stopped reaching out. The person they expected to keep holding the connection together stepped back completely. And now, the avoidant person is left sitting with something they never anticipated, a sense of absence that feels suspiciously like need. That is where the embarrassment lives. It is the uncomfortable realization that they were not as detached as they believed. The version of themselves that felt unaffected and fully in control starts cracking under the weight of a truth they never prepared for. The recognition that your presence mattered far more than they ever let themselves admit. What makes this realization even harder to sit with is the way you actually left. There was no emotional explosion, no desperate final plea, no dramatic confrontation. You walked away with composure. You chose your own dignity instead of continuing to fight for a place in someone's life that was never being offered freely. That quiet self-respect creates a very specific kind of discomfort for the avoidant person. When someone they hurt responds with grace instead of chaos, there is nowhere for them to redirect their guilt or frustration. They are left alone with it. In a lot of ways, being outmatched in dignity by the person they failed to appreciate becomes one of the hardest truths to sit with. It lingers longer than expected. It comes back in unexpected moments. And unlike a lot of other uncomfortable feelings, it does not simply fade with distance. The silence keeps quietly reminding them of who walked away and how gracefully they did it. Then there is the anger. This part matters because a lot of people mistakenly assume an avoidant person's anger means they were somehow justified or that your silence caused genuine harm. In reality, the anger usually comes from something entirely different. They are angry because the dynamic changed in a way they did not see coming. Not because you broke some agreement, but because you stopped participating in a pattern they had quietly come to rely on. They grew used to your availability. They assumed the connection would stay accessible whenever they felt ready to engage. They expected your investment to keep outweighing their own. Without ever consciously naming it, they leaned on a structure that shielded them from vulnerability while still letting them benefit from your consistency. The moment your silence became permanent enough to feel real, that structure collapsed, and anger became one of the first reactions to rise out of the wreckage. The difficult truth is that this anger is often rooted in a quiet sense of entitlement, which is exactly why it feels so uncomfortable for them to examine honestly. Deep down, many avoidant people understand that they cannot reasonably blame someone for choosing self-respect. They cannot easily justify being upset that another person stopped accepting emotional inconsistency. To fully explain their anger, they would have to acknowledge assumptions they would rather not face, that they expected you to remain available regardless of how little they offered back, that they may have taken your presence for granted in ways they never wanted to admit. That kind of self-awareness can be deeply unsettling because it clashes with the image they hold of themselves as thoughtful, reasonable, emotionally aware people. So the anger often has nowhere comfortable to land. It cannot be directed outward with any real legitimacy, and it cannot be fully accepted inward without a level of self-reflection most avoidant people spend years avoiding. Beneath the embarrassment and beneath the anger sits the emotion that matters most. It is quieter, softer, and far more painful than either of the others. It is grief. Not theoretical grief, not some abstract sadness, but real grief for the connection they had, the moments they shared with you, and the possibilities that now exist only in memory. This is usually the emotion avoidant people spend the most energy trying to avoid altogether, because their relationship with grief is complicated. Grief requires direct contact with loss. It requires acknowledging value. It requires admitting that something meaningful existed and is no longer available in the same way. For someone whose defenses are built around minimizing emotional dependence, that can feel completely overwhelming. Yet, when the silence lasts long enough, grief usually finds its way through the cracks anyway. And when it does, it forces them to confront not only what they lost, but the possibility that their own patterns played a real role in losing it. For an avoidant person, grief is especially hard because it demands something they spend most of their life trying not to confront. It requires admitting that something actually mattered. It requires recognizing that a loss hurts because what was lost had real value. And that stands in direct opposition to the story many avoidant people tell themselves about being fully self-reliant and unaffected. To truly grieve, they would have to acknowledge that you mattered deeply, that the connection held real significance, and that your absence is not easily replaced. They would have to face the possibility that what slipped away was not just another relationship among many, but something unique that carried meaning they never fully appreciated while they still had it. That is not an easy truth for someone whose defenses are built around emotional distance. Yet your silence gradually brings it into view anyway. It is worth being clear here. This grief is not caused because silence is some clever technique meant to provoke a reaction. The silence being described here is not manipulation. It simply removes the distractions that once let the avoidant stay disconnected from their own deeper feelings. While you were still reaching out, there was always something for them to focus on. They could manage the dynamic, calculate the right amount of distance, watch your responses, stay occupied by the ongoing motion of the relationship. All of that activity created noise, but once you stopped participating, the noise disappeared. Suddenly, there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to control, nothing left to monitor. What remained was a quiet space where your absence became impossible to ignore. And in that space, the emotions they had successfully avoided for so long usually start rising to the surface. When all of these feelings arrive at once, embarrassment, anger, longing, grief, and the unsettling awareness of how much they actually cared, the avoidant person's response tends to follow a fairly predictable pattern. The first reaction is usually more distance. This can look confusing from the outside, but psychologically it makes complete sense. When overwhelming feelings start pushing through their defenses, their instinct is often to lean even harder into the coping strategy that has always given them temporary relief. They create additional space. They emphasize their independence. They reinforce the image of not needing anyone. To an outside observer, this can easily look like indifference. It can appear as though they moved on effortlessly or were never affected at all, but appearances can be misleading here. Often, that increased distance is not evidence that they feel nothing. It is evidence that what they feel has become genuinely hard to manage. They retreat, not because the emotions are absent, but because the emotions have become impossible to ignore. This phase takes a real toll on the avoidant person. Maintaining the appearance of composure while quietly wrestling with unresolved feelings is emotionally exhausting. The harder they push those feelings away, the more energy it takes to sustain the illusion that everything is fine. Eventually, though, a second stage tends to emerge. After enough time passes, many avoidant people enter a period of reflection that happens almost against their will. Defenses can delay emotional processing, but they rarely eliminate it forever. In the quieter moments of life, when distractions run thin and the mind starts wandering, thoughts of you begin showing up with more honesty than before. It might happen during a sleepless night, a quiet morning, a long drive, or some routine task that leaves room for reflection. In those moments, memories return, not the broad outline of the relationship, but the specific details that carry real emotional weight. They start remembering conversations that lingered in their mind long after they ended. They think about the moments when they felt genuinely understood. They revisit the times when the walls briefly came down and real connection was allowed to exist. They remember how you saw parts of them that few people ever reached. They think about the comfort, the acceptance, and the familiarity that grew between you over time. And more importantly, they begin examining what happened to all of it. They look back at the distancing, the inconsistency, the missed opportunities, the repeated cycles that slowly wore the connection down. What once felt abstract becomes personal. The consequences of their own choices stop being theories and start becoming realities, and those realities often feel heavier than they expected them to. This is where true humility usually begins, not as a performance designed to win you back, but as a private reckoning with choices that cannot be undone and losses that suddenly feel very real. Before wrapping this up, I want to bring the focus back to you. because we have spent a lot of time exploring what may be happening inside the avoidant person. But your own growth matters far more than their reaction ever will. The silence that changes an avoidant person is rarely born from strategy. It is not usually some calculated move designed to create longing or regret. More often, it comes from reaching a limit. It comes from the exhaustion of pouring endless energy into a connection that kept failing to meet you with the same level of commitment. It comes from the moment when hope can no longer outweigh reality. When that moment arrives, silence stops being about them and starts being about you. It becomes a declaration that your energy, your time, and your emotional well-being deserve protection. It marks the point where you stop building your life around someone else's inconsistency and start building it around your own self-respect. That is exactly why your silence carries so much weight. Not because it forces another person to feel something, but because it reflects a real transformation inside you. It communicates a truth that no argument, no explanation, no emotional plea could ever express with the same strength. It says you finally recognize your own value, not as a slogan or an affirmation, but as something real and lived. It says your worth no longer depends on whether someone else chooses to acknowledge it. It says you are no longer willing to sacrifice yourself for a connection that requires you to constantly prove your importance. And regardless of what unfolds inside the avoidant person from this point forward, that realization remains the most important outcome of all, because the deepest purpose of your silence was never to change them. It was to bring you back to yourself. The avoidant person may feel embarrassed, they may feel frustrated, unsettled, or quietly humbled by what your silence revealed to them. But underneath all of those reactions sits another feeling that often goes unnoticed. In some of the deepest, most honest parts of their inner world, there is also a growing sense of respect. They may actually respect you more now than they have respected anyone in a very long time. That might sound surprising after everything that happened, but it makes sense once you understand what many avoidant people admire most. They place enormous value on independence, self-control, and emotional self-possession. These qualities sit at the core of how they define themselves. Yet, by stepping away from a dynamic that was no longer serving you, you demonstrated exactly those qualities in a way that was impossible for them to ignore. You embodied the very strength they have spent years trying to cultivate, but you expressed it with a level of consistency they themselves struggled to maintain throughout the entire relationship. The difference is impossible for them not to notice. Their own withdrawal usually came wrapped in confusion and contradiction, periods of closeness followed by distance, warmth followed by detachment, moments of connection interrupted by walls that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Their exits and retreats carried uncertainty, mixed signals, unresolved tension. Your departure, though, carried none of that. You did not disappear through games or emotional maneuvering. You did not create confusion. You simply made a decision and stood by it. There was a clarity to your silence that communicated real certainty, a calmness to it that reflected self-respect rather than resentment. And whether they admit it openly or not, that level of conviction leaves a lasting impression. It becomes something hard to forget because it represents a kind of emotional integrity that commands attention even in complete silence. What often surprises people is that respect can grow even after communication has fully stopped. The avoidant person may never say it out loud. They may never reach out and admit what they learned from losing access to you. Yet internally, many of them recognize the significance of what happened. They understand that you reached a point where you stopped negotiating your own worth. You stopped asking for what should have been offered freely. You stopped sacrificing your peace for the possibility of receiving consistency someday. Those realizations matter because they force the avoidant person to see you differently, no longer as someone who will endlessly tolerate uncertainty, but as someone who holds clear boundaries and enough self-respect to actually honor them. That shift in perception can be profound. It changes how they remember you, and it changes the meaning they attach to your absence. Most importantly, your silence communicates something that words often fail to express. You did not try to punish them. You did not turn your pain into an argument or your disappointment into a demand. You did not chase validation, beg for understanding, or fight for recognition. Instead, you let your actions speak for you. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that no longer aligned with your value. That choice carried a message stronger than any confrontation ever could, that you finally understood what you deserved, and that you were no longer willing to compromise that understanding. It showed confidence without arrogance, strength without aggression, and self-respect without hostility. And that is exactly why your silence leaves such a lasting impact. Not because it forces someone to regret losing you, although that may still happen, and not because it guarantees reflection, although it often creates the space for it. Its true power comes from what it represents. It represents the moment you stop defining yourself through someone else's inability to fully meet you. It represents the moment you chose yourself. Long after conversations fade and emotions settle, that is the part that stays. The avoidant person may forget plenty of details from the relationship, but they rarely forget the person who quietly walked away with their dignity intact. They rarely forget the person who responded to inconsistency, not with chaos, but with clarity. And they rarely forget the lesson your silence ultimately taught them, that genuine self-worth does not need to argue for its own value. It simply recognizes it, honors it, and refuses to settle for anything less. There is one more piece worth naming here, something that rarely gets talked about in these conversations. Silence does not just change how the avoidant person sees you, it changes how you see yourself. Somewhere in the process of letting go of the chase, you start rebuilding a relationship with your own time, your own attention, your own peace of mind. The hours that used to disappear into wondering what a certain silence meant, or replaying a conversation looking for hidden clues, slowly get returned to you. You start noticing your own life again, the parts of it that had quietly gone blurry while your focus stayed fixed on someone who could not meet you consistently. That return to yourself is not a small thing. It is often the real turning point, the moment healing stops being theoretical and starts becoming something you can actually feel in your everyday life. It also helps to remember that none of this requires the avoidant person to ever come back, apologize, or explain themselves for your growth to count. Their reflection, their embarrassment, their grief, all of that may happen entirely off-screen, completely disconnected from your life going forward. And that is fine, because your healing was never supposed to depend on their timeline. You do not need a phone call, a long overdue apology, or a moment of closure handed to you on their schedule. You already have what you need, which is the clarity to recognize what serves you and the willingness to walk away from what does not. That clarity does not fade just because someone else eventually catches up to what you already understood months ago. Take care of yourself while you carry that forward, and I will see you in the next one.